An empire on rails. Let's take a first look at the trunk lines. Early railroads in America served local markets. They're not national railroad lines. Typically, they were less than 50 miles long, and they had a lot of problems. There were conflicting schedules with different railroad companies on these short tracks. There are separate stations. So if you take a train into Indianapolis, you may then have to travel through the city of Indianapolis to get onto another station to go on to Chicago. And there are even different gauges. In other words, different widths between the tracks. So there are some tracks that certain trains can just not go on because they are a different gauge. The Civil War, though, and the cooperation that the North experienced during the Civil War really showed the value of having long, efficient tracks. And as a result, we see a lot of consolidation after the Civil War. That means large companies are buying out small companies and adding them to their larger company. And as a result, we get standardization throughout the railroad industry. And in 1886, Congress approves a standard gauge of railroad track. Every piece of track laid after 1886, and a lot of the ones even before that, are going to be a specific width apart so that all trains can travel on them. The 4 trunk lines are the most important railroads back east. These are the Baltimore and Ohio, the Erie, the New York Central, owned by Cornelius Vanderbilt, and the Pennsylvania Railroad. These are the ones that connect the eastern markets and seaports with the Midwest. These are the ones that can even bring things coming via western rivers like the Missouri River and the Great Plains can bring those to eastern markets. These are the railroad lines that are going to replace the Mississippi as the hub of transportation in America. They all had feeder lines or smaller lines that fed into them, and they are really going to link the Northeast, New England, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, with the American Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, out into Iowa even. The South takes longer to develop their railroad industry. They needed capital. They needed money for investment from the North and from Europeans. But in the 1880s, there was a boom in railroad construction in the South. And by 1900, the Old South, the Southeast, is fully integrated into the National Railroad Network. Now, how do these improvements change transportation? We see automatic couplers, air brakes, refrigerator cars, dining cars, heated cars, electric switches, and stronger locomotives. All of these, in some way or another, are either going to make railroad transportation faster, or maybe more comfortable, or maybe even safer. And the railroads are going to play a significant role in how we view time in the United States. Before the railroad companies standardized time, noon was considered when the sun was at its highest point. That's fine if you're a farmer. It's not very good if you're trying to catch a train. So the railroads are going to use 4 time zones so that all the trains are running at consistent times. Congress doesn't begin using this until 1918 during World War I, when Congress had to use the railroad companies a lot to move troops and supplies around the country. Remember, when we talk about the Transcontinental Railroad, which we'll move on to now, sectional disagreement had really prevented the railroad from being built. In 1845, Northerners and Southerners couldn't agree where to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Same thing 10 years later in 1855. But in 1862, when it came up, there were no Southerners to object to building a Northern Railroad line. Now, that little dark gray area you see down there is known as the Gadsden Purchase, and that's going to come much, much later. But that's actually a chunk of land that was bought to build a southern route to California. Railroad companies are given 1 mile of track, for every 1 mile of track, the railroad companies would receive 20 square miles of land in that alternating pattern that we see here on both north and south of their track. They also received a 30-year loan of at least $16,000. And sometimes they got even more money if it was very difficult terrain. Again, these railroad companies got 20 square miles to the north and south of the track, and they got very low interest loans that they could pay off over 30 years. This is a huge win for the railroad companies. Two main companies building the first transcontinental railroad. The first is the Union Pacific, going from east to west. They basically started in Nebraska, and they're going to head towards the Pacific coast. Construction is slow at first, but after the Civil War, construction really picks up. It's led by General Grenville Dodge, and he's going to really use a lot of former soldiers and Irish immigrants to build the track. They do suffer from some Indian attacks as they move through Indian territory, but for the most part, they're building over really flat land. On the other side is the Central Pacific, starting on the west coast and heading east. It's led by Charles Crocker, and eventually they're going to use mostly Chinese workers directly from China. And these Chinese workers are going to be the ones who are doing the most dangerous work, blasting through the mountains. Transcontinental Railroad is completed in 1869. This creates a real symbol of unity for the nation. We've brought the two coasts together. It's also a symbol of American progress, of engineering optimism. If we can dream it, we can build it in America. That's the belief in 1869. And it also, along with the Suez Canal, created that same year in Egypt, helps create a more linked economy, not just in America, but in the world. You might notice that this photo excludes any African American and Chinese immigrants who were working on the Transcontinental Railroad. By 1893, though, there are 5 major lines going to the west. And this exhibits one of the problems with the railroads, and that is overbuilding. Speculators like this man, Jay Gould, bought railroad stock and bought railroad stock and bought railroad stock and kept talking it up to drive that stock value up. And as a result, eventually, by 1885, 1/3 of all railroad stock is drastically overvalued. For example, a railroad company might be worth $10,000, but there's $20,000 in stock out there. The stock is double what it should be. Competition leads to those railroads creating special rates and favors for businesses. To try to lure big business, they created incentive packages basically for big businesses. They gave free passes to large shippers. They reduced the rates on bulk shipping, and they even gave what were called rebates. These were secret, private, unpublished rates saved exclusively for big companies. For example, in 1880, the New York Central Railroad line granted 6,000 special rates. The railroads attempt to cooperate and not compete and share traffic. There's even the Eastern Trunk Line Association, which is formed. Now, these are unsuccessful because there's no way to keep people, to make people keep their word. But again, we see this idea of businesses cooperating. And the Panic of 1893 has a lot to do with railroads. 1/4 of all railroad companies are going bankrupt, including 2 of those trunk lines and 3 of the transcontinental railroad lines. So there's an attempt to consolidate, the big ones buying up the little ones, but there's still too much consolidation. They're having problems. The banks have to step in, led by this man, J.P. Morgan, and they're going to refinance those railroad companies. They're going to try to gain control. Well, they are going to gain control of the railroad companies by picking the people on the board of directors. And they're going to have those board of directors end competition. Now that we have the same people owning a lot of the railroad companies and putting people that they want on the board of directors, there's going to be a guarantee that there's not going to be competition. So by 1900, there are 7 major railroad companies that are controlling 65% of the miles of track. And those 7 companies are controlled by just a few investment banks like J.P. Morgan's. This makes the railroad industry very centralized and very efficient, but it also means that there's very little competition, which is bad for consumers.